Okay, pressing go now.
Okay. Okay. Welcome to the quarterly hearing of the Home Affairs Minister regards COVID-19 and some other topics. I'll get everybody to introduce themselves briefly. I'm Deputy Robert Ward and I chair the Home Affairs Scrutiny panel. Perhaps we'd like to go through the panel first and then with the Minister and their officers. That would be great, and the Assistant Minister. So, panel.
I'm Deputy St John, Trevor Poynter, and I'm a member of the panel.
Deputy Louise Dublé of St Saviour.
Deputy Roland Hewlin of St Peter.
Constable Len Norman, Minister for Home Affairs.
Deputy Gregory Guida of St Lawrence, Assistant Minister for Home Affairs.
Good afternoon, Julian Blaisby, Director General, Justice and Home Affairs.
Good afternoon, Pete Gavey, Chief Ambulance Officer.
Good afternoon, Robert Smith, Chief of Police.
I think that's just about everybody. Scrutiny officers tend not to introduce themselves, but we'll get started. Okay, Deputy Dublé, I believe you're going to start us off with some questions regards domestic abuse situations, etc. Would you like to start?
Yeah, thank you. Minister, what support is available to families dealing with domestic violence as a result of the current situation?
Well, the full scope of services provided by the states has been available during lockdown, during the COVID epidemic, and will continue to be as it was beforehand. So that's everything for the Children and Families Hub, the Youth Inquiry Service. Then, of course, we've had the Connect Me initiative, which has been very successful. The Jersey Women's Refuge has been operating at full pelt, along with the Sexual Abuse Referral Centre, the SARC. So the support in this area has been maintained at the highest possible level, because it was recognised at the very beginning with lockdown there was a threat. There was a threat to increase domestic violence, and the states, the government, and the police indeed responded very positively to that threat.
Indeed, and a campaign has been initiated asking islanders to report domestic abuse. And has this been engaged with at all, and to what level? And how many reports have you had since that campaign was initiated?
Yeah, you know, you're quite right. That was a campaign at the beginning of the lockdown to ask the public to be ears and eyes in the situation. I don't know, if Robin has more detail and numbers-wise on that particular issue, the result of that campaign, or generally on the numbers.
Thank you, Minister. Not directly on the Eyes and Ears campaign, although I'm sure we could get that specifically referenced. Since the stay-at-home order from around the 30th of the 3rd to actually to today's date, in terms of actual incidents, we have seen an increase of up 10%. So that's from 182 to 200. So that compares the period of last year to the period of this year. So we've seen an increase in incidents. In terms of crime as a result of those incidents, we've actually seen a 37% reduction. And to give you a sense of the numbers, that's 103 in the same period in 2019 to 65 in the period of what some people call lockdown. But I treat those numbers with a high degree of caution. And the reason for that is I still think that there could be a number of legacy issues as we ease our way out of lockdown, and we are likely to see more reports, more historical reports, as well as the here and now.
And in terms of the sources of complaints and referrals, has there been any change in terms of where the reports are coming from?
not that I've got any further information, any different avenues of information coming in. As the Minister has explained, there are lots of opportunities, whether it's via the SARC or whether it's with Women's Refuge or our IDFA service. There are lots of services that have been publicised over the period of lockdown and beyond to really provide the very best service to islanders.
And you mentioned that although the reports were increased by 10%, the actual crime levels were lower. Can you just explain what exactly that means, please? The crime levels.
It might be that we go to an incident, but it may not be that a crime has occurred. Sometimes, sometimes arguments happen, I guess. But if there is a crime, i.e. someone has been assaulted, as you can imagine, that reporting is actually less than it was compared to the same period last year.
And why do you think that is?
I think, it could be a number of answers there, I guess. I still say, though, I'm looking at these numbers with a good degree of caution as we ease our way out of lockdown, in the same way that I think we could see historic reporting. I think there is a potential that we could see historical reporting for sexual offences as well. So we keep a close eye on that in addition to domestic abuse.
Okay, thank you. And can I just go back to the Minister? Minister, you mentioned the Women's Refuge, and as I understand it, the Women's Refuge as an organisation were already calling for increased levels of support from the states even before we had lockdown measures. Can you just explain whether you've had any dialogue with them about perhaps increasing resources or support to them, given that there are an increased level of referrals?
There certainly hasn't been any request at my level. Whether there's been anything from the Building a Better, Safer Society level, whether there's been a request there, I'm not sure. But any request would clearly be dealt with sympathetically and positively. No question about that. Nothing's come to me yet. Whether it's on its way, whether it's been dealt with at another level, I've yet to find out.
I can see Mr. Blade's been nodding there. I wonder if he wanted to come in on that.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, there has been some a business case put forward for some additional funding for the refuge and also other emergency accommodation. So to deal with category 5, which is vulnerable groups, whether those members of the public who are suffering from domestic abuse as victims or there's drug and alcohol challenges. There has been, as I say, a business case put forward. Government have provided additional funding for additional space to enable the refuge to operate at maximum capacity and create additional housing, appropriate housing where applicable for victims or, as I say, those people who are struggling in life. So yes.
Thank you. And can you give any further detail on the contents of that business case, including the additional funding and space that's been looked at, please?
I haven't got the figures to hand in terms of the amount of units, but I think it's upwards of around 30 units that have been provided. And I think the sum is in the region of £100,000, which will provide 3 months worth of additional capacity in the system that will see us through, particularly in the next stages of stay-at-home orders, which should then release pressure on the system to enable things to return back to whatever a new normal looks like.
Thank you. And Minister, just to come back to you, are you able to reassure islanders that where there is a case of domestic abuse in the home, that if housing is needed in the long term, that people will have a right to be housed even if they do not have housing qualifications?
Well, so I'm not responsible for the housing and work law. All we can do is provide the essential immediate need, and clearly that what is needed in the longer term has to be resolved in a wider forum than just my department.
Thank you. Yes, I understand that. Okay, just going now to services and how they're being coordinated. Can you give an overview of the different services that are responding to issues of domestic abuse at this time and how they're working together, please?
Well, it's the children. Sorry, is that you, Julia? Sorry, I thought someone was going to speak there. But the safeguarding partnership board, the police, the domestic abuse support, they're all working together with the Children and Families Hub to make sure that there's information, there's support, and people who do need assistance can easily find out the right route for their particular circumstances.
And who has ultimate oversight of this work, please?
Well, it's a safeguarding partnership board is the ultimate authority in this area.
And in terms of ministerial oversight, who is the minister in charge of that board?
To be honest with you, I'm not too sure. I mean, I'm not sure if that's the Children's Minister or does it come under. I'm sorry, Deputy. I'd have to check. I'd have to check that out.
Okay, perhaps you could get back to us on that.
Can you hear me?
Who's that? Who's that?
It's Deputy.
Oh, it's Trevor.
John.
Deputy
Yeah.
Poynton. Sorry.
If I can be of help here, Safeguarding Board chair was responsible directly to the Chief Minister in the past. I would imagine that is the case currently.
That sounds logical. That sounds logical.
Thank you, Deputy Poynton. And so on that, how is the work in this area being monitored to ensure that it is effectively supporting individuals and families?
Well, I think what we're doing is seeing the actual results, as the police chief was saying a few minutes ago. While we're seeing an increase in reports, people actually coming forward to the police, to the partnership. That gives us the confidence that it's working well. That we're getting the reports, even if we're not necessarily, and perhaps it's a good thing, perhaps it's not a good thing, depends on which way you look at it. We're not getting the criminal activity that might have been expected.
And how do you? Is there a mechanism whereby you obtain feedback from victims on how their case was dealt with?
Well, I think that would be a matter for the police, for the SARP, for the agencies themselves.
Can I ask a quick question, Louise, just before?
Yeah, go ahead.
So just to chip in, there was a mention of a drop in reported domestic abuse crimes, and at a particular time like this with lockdown, does that not concern you quite significantly that we've seen a drop where you may well expect a rise given the pressure that people are under, and which could be a catalyst to these sorts of behaviours? And particularly I'm thinking of controlling behaviour within a family, which is a serious issue in domestic abuse, which isn't so obvious. And what can you do, or what is being done to try and uncover, or to look at that situation as in the circumstances we're in now?
Thank you, Deputy Warder. I think the simple answer to your direct question is, does it concern me? The answer to that is yes. We are, of course, talking about a 3 or 4 week period compared to the 3 or 4 week period over in 2019. However, a 37, whilst the numbers are relatively low, a 37% decrease is very large, I would suggest. So the answer to your question is yes. What are we doing about it? Because as I mentioned before, both with this and indeed the reporting of sexual offences, I think we should look at these numbers with a degree of caution, largely because I think we could get some historical reports over the next coming weeks. Certainly those ambient numbers of reports have started to increase since the stay-at-home order has been eased, a number of incidents over the weekend. But as the Minister has already referred to, within the first couple of weeks of the stay-at-home order, you may have seen the Eyes and Ears campaign, which I thought was very good, and that was out on social media as well, really to tell potential victims that we are still here, we are here to listen, and we are here to respond. Importantly, all of those services and indeed policing didn't stop as a result of lockdown, and that's what that campaign was trying to do.
Okay, thank you.
I think it's probably worth noting that our social habits, all of our social habits, have changed over the last 6 to 8 weeks. The nighttime economy has changed totally from, you know, bars and restaurants and so on to beach parties. So there's a different dynamic going on, which would have an effect on this sort of crime, but all this sort of incident. But we also know and believe that this sort of incident is underreported. It's still underreported, and that's why I'm very keen that which we're working on before all this happened, the new domestic violence law, which I'm still hoping we'll be able to bring before the Assembly before the end of the year. But that you mentioned coercive or controlling behaviour, Chairman. That's all part of that, which is very important.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, Louise.
Can I just go back to the Chief of Police, please? And in terms of reporting domestic abuse, I think we've discussed in other contexts families that don't have access to the internet and issues around accessing homeschooling. But it occurs to me that actually if a family doesn't have access to the internet or possibly a phone line and an individual is isolated in the home without these communication routes, how can we encourage or enable people to have ways to report that don't use a telephone or a computer? Are there any ways that the police are facilitating that?
Well, I think what we have seen as a result of the crisis is that there is a greater, if you like, neighbourly spirit. I think there are more people talking to each other. Maybe it's across the fence these days. I think probably families are probably talking more than they used to, and so I think that's one of the options we've got. Of course, to if you like, reinforce the point you've made, we would get a number of reports via the schools as well, whether it was about domestic violence or indeed sexual offences. So that sort of adds to the concern, because that would be another very, very good route and very well considered route, speaking to trusted people. My expectation again is that when the schools reopen, you know, carefully and safely, we again could see quite a spike in reports, some of which will be domestic abuse related.
Will you be doing any work with children in the schools, you know, to try and ascertain whether children have been witnessing abuse or victims of abuse?
So my team, my senior team, are working with SIPES, with Mark Rogers' team and Mark Owers, where we've set up a team. It's not a safeguarding team, where we are looking at what can we reasonably expect when lockdown reaches its various sort of end stages, and how prepared are we for that. And some of that with Mark Owers' team, particularly talking about young people in this regard, is how we ready ourselves for it. We've only had one initial meeting, but the discussions have been had now for a number of weeks.
Okay. And you mentioned about people talking to neighbours. Can you just reiterate the advice, please, on what people should do if they either have a disclosure from a neighbour or if they witness something next door?
Well, I think the important advice on all of these things is just to keep it simple. I think people instinctively know what they're being told. Sometimes it could be, sort of discreet pleas for help, but go ahead, contact the police. There are other numbers, and I appreciate not everybody has access to the internet, and indeed not everybody wants to ring the police. So the Minister has explained a number of other places where you can ring, but for those members of the public and Islanders who are watching this, you know, I would say contact the police and we'll deal with that information carefully, sensitively, and deal with it.
So it's okay for somebody to call, is it 999 you'd want them to call, or is it the 612 612 if they witness something but they're not 100% certain that it is abuse, but they just have a concern?
I think unless it's an emergency, and sometimes it will be an emergency, then dial 999. Alternatively, if it's a sharing of information which we need to respond to, it's the 6 number you just mentioned.
That's helpful, thank you. And I had a question about this SARC. What procedures are in place in that facility that will protect staff and victims and ensure that the service can operate effectively?
Well, I don't know how many members have been to the Sexual Assault Referral Centre. I visited it a month or two ago before lockdown. It is hard for me to recall a time when I have not met with more professional people who are sensitive, caring. They were busy contacting previous victims, and you mentioned earlier about how do we assess what our service is like. One of the members of the team was actively ringing victims to provide them with additional support, some of whom were cautious and reluctant and needed additional support, and they got that. And I invite anyone to go there to see the professional job that they do. They are true professionals.
Thank you. I'm nearly finished in this area. I just wanted to go back to Mr. Blaseby, who was talking about the business case for the Women's Refuge. And is there a date whereby a final decision will be made on that business case, and who is it that makes the final decision, please?
My understanding is that the decision has been made. Actually, it was through the competent authorities meeting and the Emergencies Council meeting that we, along with a number of other business cases in response to COVID as a government, have the opportunity to share those business cases with those relevant ministers at those meetings and get those decisions supported, or indeed decisions made. So that has been through that process.
And what was the decision?
Sorry, yes, the
Obvious question.
I missed the obvious answer to that. In the affirmative. So yes, it was agreed, supported.
Okay, and can details of that extra support be forwarded to the panel, please?
Yes, indeed.
When will those details be made public?
I can find out, but certainly I can get the details for the panel. I can share that through the Scrutiny Officer, and I'll look at when those details can be made public and let you know.
Thank you very much.
Can I just ask, is that, sorry Louise, just to ask, is that funding just for 1 year?
No, that business case was for 3 months, as I mentioned earlier, just to see those services and wider support agencies through the particular demand as we move through the various stages of stay at home. And the expert advice from those involved in policy making and those from an operational point of view is that 3 months worth of funding should take the pressure out of the system and enable those people who require emergency accommodation particularly to get back to a steady state. But clearly that will be kept under review if that pressure remains beyond 3 months.
And that would require another business case?
Yes, that's correct, yeah.
Okay. Sorry, Louise.
No, that's helpful, thank you. My final question is, does the Minister have any other information in relation to domestic abuse that he would like to highlight to the public?
Well, no, I think we've gone through this with you pretty thoroughly. We've given you the numbers that we have, but it's something that we take extremely seriously. And as I've said to the panel before, a new domestic violence law is right at the top of our priorities. Unfortunately, with everything else, it's been put back a few months, but I'm looking forward to bringing it to the States, hopefully before the end of the year.
That's helpful.
Okay, I think it's Deputy Hoolin next.
Could I come in there just for a moment? 2 things. One, I trust that the new law will not be a domestic violence law, but a domestic abuse law.
Absolutely right. Yes. Absolutely right.
And secondly, can I go back to what we were saying about housing for those people who are the victims of domestic abuse, whether they be male, female or otherwise, and they don't have housing qualifications. My wife is a psychotherapist. We will not be giving any confidentialities away to let you know that there are several of her clients that have experienced such a circumstance, in that there's been a marriage breakdown and the partner has not had housing qualifications, but and puts that individual into a dilemma in relation to accommodation, both for self and for children. Would it be in relation to the declared policy that we don't want to work in silos, be appropriate for the Justice and Home Affairs, well, for Home Affairs, to work very closely with the Children's and Housing Minister to put a proposition together that works for these people to relieve them of the acute stress they experience, and the fact that they are often put out of their family home as a result of a breakdown. A hugely important area for probably a very small number of people.
Well, what I can say, Deputy, is in the present situation, the present crisis, the Home Affairs Department, Justice and Home Affairs Department, through the Director General and the Housing Minister, have been working very closely together on emergency accommodation for all sorts of people who need it. But you're quite right. I don't want to feel that anybody would be trapped in an abusive relationship and not leave that relationship, or not get support out of that relationship because of fear of housing qualifications. So this is something which once this crisis is over, we can look at in some detail, and I'd be quite happy to do that.
Oh, thank you for that, Minister. I have to declare to the Chair that I'm having an acute problem with my battery, and I may be forced to move out of this meeting. I don't know.
You're definitely frozen, Deputy.
Yeah, I'm having extreme difficulty, but there you go. I may have to absent myself because of technology.
Can I just say that I know Deputy Doublé has to leave in a moment for another appointment, and if that is the case, then we wouldn't be quorate, I believe. So we may have to suspend the meeting until you come back. So that's hopefully an encouragement to your battery to carry on working.
No, I simply can't get it to charge. I don't know why. Everything's plugged in, but it won't charge, and we're down to a minimum level. Anyway, we'll carry on until I disappear.
Okay, Deputy Hewley, I think you've got the next next set of questions.
Yeah, well, thank you. This is on the lockdown, Minister. Can you please confirm how many individuals been arrested to date for breaching any rules in relation to lockdown?
The last thing I had for arrests, and no doubt the police chief could update me if it's different, was 19.
That number is total enforcements has just gone up to 21. It was 19 until a couple of days ago, Minister.
So a quiet weekend. And what's been the outcome of those arrests insofar as fines, etc., the ongoing process?
As you may have seen in the very early days of the arrests that we made throughout, prior to even lockdown, it's been important that we have worked closely, as you may have seen, with our honorary colleagues, and we have tried to make clear that our stance has always been that we are policing the virus as opposed to policing islanders, the vast majority of which I think everybody accepts, and even the information and the data that has come out from the modelling, that islanders absolutely understood the importance of some form of isolation, etc. However, there have been those individuals over time that, if I am being probably brutally honest, would probably have been arrested had there not been any form of lockdown. Some of them in particular, and as you may have seen, the first few went before the magistrate and were fined some significant amounts of money in the region of around £500. Some of those that have been arrested have not gone to court, where there is not necessarily the evidence to support what we've tried to do. But what is important is that everyone that has been arrested has previously been warned 3 times. And I've even heard it myself listening to the police radio, that they will check on our database to see whether a certain individual has already been given words of advice. In fact, I've got the information here. Since the period of stay at home, we've given words of advice to 1,513 people. And that is, you know, and the vast majority of those deputy have listened very carefully and adhered to the advice. So very small number, I would suggest, numbers of arrests. But as we may move on to, actually enforcing the restrictions now, the regulations now, is becoming more and more tricky as we ease out of lockdown, and that there is a, if you like to use the phrase, a growing minority of those that are not listening, particularly to the social distancing regulations and requirements coming out of ministers and indeed from doctors.
Okay, so 1,500 odd words of advice down to 22 arrests. Just specifically, this is a bit tactical, but of those £500 fines, how many have actually been fined and how many have just been warned after arrest?
I haven't got all of that information to hand, but I can certainly get it for you probably fairly quickly, actually, but I can give you a breakdown of each of those 20.
It's not that important. It's more out of interest, really. How many reports are the police receiving on a daily basis in relation to potential breaches? So how many phone calls are coming in, etc., to the police of concerned citizens?
As of this weekend, in fact, this is from just this weekend, we had 23 calls that were described as what we described as COVID related, 24 alcohol related. But the issue here, of course, is as we've eased out of lockdown, we've also now reached ambient levels of crime and demand. So whereas you've seen in some of the information I previously provided, frankly, crime and assaults, you know, effectively fell off a cliff. Crime was down at one stage, approaching 60% at the height of the lockdown period, compared to the same period last year. But what we're seeing now is not only COVID-related incidents, and predominantly they are concerned members of the public who are contacting the police to advise us of concerns, largely, I have to say, with groups of people in beaches and indeed in parks. But we're also dealing with what you would call normal business, or what I might describe as normal business, normal policing business, some of which is young people, some of which is mental health, some of which is crime, etc., etc.
Do you see, you said the 60%, which is a very interesting stat at the outset. Do you see that as we are easing out, that is increasing? What I'm aiming at, is there becoming a degree of, I don't want to put words or ideas into words, towards a bit more apathy towards these restrictions?
I think it's a really good question. So what was approaching a 60% reduction in reported crime, certainly during the, if you like, the height of the lockdown, that has steadily increased as correspondingly the government have gone through the stages and the lockdown has been eased. So, for example, in May, just as we come towards the end of May, reported crime is probably at the end of May going to be on a similar, maybe just under what crime reported in 2019. So it's steadily gone up, and I would think if there was a graph, the graph would show as we've eased lockdown, crime and reported incidents have gone up as well as people have come out. Now, I think that was entirely predictable. I do think, though, that there is a view, and you may have heard me say this before, that the regulations have been eased, but they've not been ended. And I think we should all be very cautious about thinking that they have been ended, which is some of the reasons why we have taken some enforcement action over the last couple of weekends, which you may have seen, largely almost exclusively around social distancing.
Do you see, you said the graph has gone, the 60% has gone off to sort of parity as we approach the end of May. Do you see that graph extending in its route, or do you see it flattening to be back to the norm?
Another really good question. I think we always see increased crime, certainly from looking at projected figures, which we look at quite regularly in terms of our performance meetings. Crime will increase into the summer months for reasons that people will understand. We will see decreases in, if you like, pubs and clubs, but as the Minister neatly described, the nighttime economy has changed.
Sorry, what was that?
The nighttime economy has changed. So we still have a nighttime economy, but probably more importantly, it's an unregulated nighttime economy. So in pubs and clubs, there's a degree of regulation. The licensees and the staff will stop serving drink to people when they've had enough. What we're now seeing is people buying alcohol and then going to, whether it's in their homes or more specifically, as you may have seen in the media, they're going to, you know, the wonderful beaches and consuming alcohol in groups there. So the night economy has shifted. To answer your question specifically, though, I see reported crime going back to what I would describe as the ambient levels. That as we move into June, I expect the levels of crime to be identical, if not slightly more in June, because we could see some reporting from, as I've already mentioned, some historical reporting. But effectively, whilst we're at 6 hours, that really has just not changed crime. Crime is now back. Crime and incidence is back to its original levels.
Do you see a trend, perhaps, of the change of the way people enjoy themselves, whereby we all know it's very, very expensive to drink in the nightclubs and bars of Jersey, and people are now buying off-licence alcohol, which by definition is going to be considerably cheaper, and enjoying that on the beaches? Do you see a bit of a migration in that direction, which could change the way you have to police?
Again, I think we need to be alert in all kinds of different crimes and incidents, how we might see what you described as a migration or a change in people's behaviour and activity as a result of the virus. It's something that we need to be alive to. So my team have just finished the first draft of a crime prevention strategy, which is looking through the lens of COVID-19 to say, well, what's changed and what's different. It's also to look ahead to see where there might be some strategic and tactical advantages we might have as a result of this. Do we want to go back to, you know, the nighttime economy where lots of police officers would be out and about on particularly a Friday and Saturday night, effectively patrolling pubs and clubs? Is there a better way of doing that? I do think the majority, though, to answer your question specifically, will go back to the pubs just because of that social interaction, when of course that's safe to do so. But I dare say the legacy will be there will be drinking as well on our beaches.
I think Louise wants to jump in.
Yeah, just a quickie on the words of advice that have been given out, and I can't remember the number. It was over 1,000, I think. Do you have a breakdown of those? And I'm particularly interested in how many of those were given to children.
We might have a breakdown in children, because when we have an interaction with children, we fill in a particular form because we've spoken to a young person. So I might be able to find that information. In terms of a wider breakdown, I think that's unlikely in terms of age or ethnicity, etc. I think it's likely we've got that information. And that, of course, is over the period of the lockdown, including ourselves and our honorary police colleagues.
Thank you. If that could be passed to the panel, if that's available, please. And just to go back to the enforcement policy that the police stated of engage, explain, encourage, enforce, is that still the policy? And how is that working with children as opposed to adults? Are children complying at the early stages?
That policy is still in force, and I think it's as valued now and as important now as it was when we first introduced it a good number of weeks ago now. I think the step up is understood, and I think the escalation is good, to the extent that we very rarely have to get to the enforcement stage, if you like, and I think that that's testimony to some really good policing and a good use of discretion as well. In terms of young people, I would say certainly in the last few weeks, most of our interactions are with young people, particularly on the beaches and in the parks. I won't say exclusively, but I would say a large proportion does involve young people. Just before this meeting, I was looking at some CCTV footage and indeed some body-worn video from police officers, and it is almost exclusively young people who, and they wouldn't they, of course, go to the beaches and enjoy this beautiful island. The problem is, of course, it's when they don't social distance.
Sorry, so young people, is this under 18, or are we talking about that next gap of young people up to say 21, 22, 23?
I would say it is, yeah, some of them are under 18, maybe as young as 14, 15, and then moving up to maybe into the early mid 20s for some of the sort of barbecue type events that we're seeing. It's not very scientific, but that's more or less what I'm seeing.
I think Trevor's got a question.
Yeah, I've got a question, because what we're talking about here is statistics. And we're having to ask the question in raw form, rather than having some evidence presented to us. Now, your colleagues in the social services are actually producing for us on a weekly basis a dashboard which tells us what issues have been occurring within the social services over that period of time. And I wondered if this might be something that you could collaborate with them on, in terms of producing statistics that we could see on a regular basis, that wouldn't necessitate necessarily a public hearing. Might inform a public hearing, but would give us a almost real-time idea of what is happening out there in the island. And after all, we eventually are going to have to take the decisions about how we respond to what's happening out there in the island.
Yes, we have got a lot of management information which we could legitimately share. Since the very first day when the regulations came in, we've recorded every interaction, every vehicle that's been stopped, as I've already mentioned, every arrest, every premises that we've been to, so we can happily provide any of that information. But well,
that's why I suggest the idea, because I have knowledge of the fact that police, like the army and other uniformed organisations, capture information and keep it to themselves generally. Could we perhaps have some of this information regularly transmitted to us in graph form, in data form, in whatever form is thought to be most helpful?
Very happy to do that. We can talk about what elements of the information you'd like. I'm sure we can cut it any way you like and provide some form of dashboard which would help inform the panel. Great.
A question for the Minister here, and you may wish to pass it on, in relation to the law that we're going to be debating very shortly, or the draft law we're going to be debating very shortly, about social distancing. How are you going to manage that from an enforcement point of view?
That's a very interesting one, Deputy, because the way I see it, and Robert Smith will no doubt comment as well, it is changing the dynamics considerably, because if that is approved tomorrow, in fact, we're going to be debating it, then it is no longer
so soon.
I believe so. Then it will no longer be illegal to enter somebody else's property, somebody else's house. It will no longer be illegal to stay out for longer than 6 hours, and it will only be illegal not to physical distance if you're requested to do so by a police officer and then refuse to do so. So the dynamics are going to change, but the policing currently will be exactly the same as it is now. The only sanction the police will have will be to arrest someone who refuses to physical distance, hold them in a police cell, call down a centenier to make the charge, and the centenier will then have to make the decision whether to send that person to court or to a parish hall inquiry. So
now that's interesting, because that's your spin on the idea, but it would seem the health minister has a completely different idea and is suggesting that tickets to instructing an individual to attend a parish hall inquiry would be an appropriate way forward, and that they would at the parish hall inquiry be given an opportunity to explain themselves, and a range of fines up to £200 would be available to the centenier to levy if necessary.
Yeah, I thought that's what I said. The centenier would decide when he makes a charge whether to refer to a parish hall inquiry or to court. And if it goes to a parish hall inquiry, the alleged perpetrator would have the opportunity of agreeing that he was in the wrong and accepting a fine from the centenier. Or the centenier might just give words of advice or caution, or if he doesn't accept the ruling of the centenier, he would then go on to court. One of the problems is at the moment, of course, there are no parish hall inquiries. That they're not expected to restart probably until September, so that there would be a difficulty there. But the centenier would have if the law is passed as amended tomorrow, the centenier would have the choice of parish hall inquiry or court.
Can I just let Louise finish her question, and then we'll probably come back to that topic anyway. Do you want to just jump in quickly, Louise, because I know you have to leave?
Yeah, I was questioning the Chief on the engage, explain, encourage, enforce. Just to clarify, words of advice, where does that sit on those 4 levels? Is that explain or encourage?
You know, it probably is all of the first 3. To be fair, it is all about trying to persuade people not to do whatever they're doing against the restrictions. So I'd say all 3, and by the time we've done all 3, well, we're at 4, and then, you know, persuasion has gone by.
And you said that the words of advice that you'd given, that actually the majority were to young people and children. Does that have any permanent record when you've given words of advice?
We certainly make a record of when we've given words of advice. We don't always necessarily, I think I'd have to just check on this, whether we take names, dates of birth and all the rest of it. But we've certainly got a record of every time we've had an interaction, both ourselves and our honorary police colleagues. And the reason why I asked for that to be done was, one, particularly for this sort of scrutiny, so that we can say what we've done during the period of the regulations, justify what we've done in a completely and open and transparent way. So that we can, you know, justify that to you. But I'll have a look at what the additional levels of detail we've got around the words of advice. One thing is true, though, that the majority do listen to the words of advice. But I think that that's going to become more and more tricky as we go into the summer months. The words of advice may not cut it.
Thank you. So thank you for that explanation. So the words of advice wouldn't necessarily, if a young person received those words of advice, that wouldn't affect any impact on their future life opportunities in any way?
Absolutely not.
Okay, and just on the final level, the enforce level, have any, and children now, I mean under 18s, have you had to go to that level with any under 18s?
I'm just going to check through my numbers, so I'll give you exactly the right answer from check. I believe there are some under 18s that have been arrested, but I just need to check to be absolutely right.
I mean, if that's not readily available now, then perhaps it could be forwarded to the panel.
Yes, of course. It's a small number, but I don't want to say yes or no until I'm absolutely certain for the benefit of the panel.
Okay. Yeah, if that can be forwarded, because I'm conscious of time and we need to move on. Deputy Hewlin, have you got much more in this topic to cover?
Actually, one of the what we're going to talk about is the ensuring these measures are being enforced consistently across the board, and what are the police doing to ensure that?
Of course, discretion's everything, but very, very early doors. The police set up what we describe as a gold group. You know, members may be familiar with that. And in that gold group were a number of my senior team, but also Danny Scaife to represent our honorary police colleagues. And why we saw that was important is that there is a consistency in the way we deliver the 4 E's throughout the period of the stay-at-home order, otherwise known as lockdown. And we have flexed that how we've policed that over the last few weeks. So, for example, you may recall that it coincided with the first Easter break, and I know we were all nervous about what the first Easter break might bring. And actually, it turned out to be very good, despite the fact the weather was very good. So a lot more cars were stopped in the first few days, because what we were trying to do is help islanders adjust, set the new battle rhythm, adjust behaviour in a sensitive way. And we did that very closely with our honorary police colleagues. In fact, they did a lion's share of the car stops and the advice that was given, for which I am enormously grateful. So we work very closely together to try and provide a consistency of message to help and support Highlanders.
Can you share with us what advice is given in the first instance to anybody that needs challenging, shall we say, for breaching lockdown?
First, it's not particularly scripted. It doesn't go to that particular level, because we just adopted the 4 E's. And indeed, in the first few days, indeed on the first day, I was out with some colleagues stopping members of the public. And the vast majority were there, prepared. They knew the regulations. I can't deny that some looked a bit embarrassed, and I think that that's where we've had, the social conscience, the public conscience of this is where I think the greatest success has been had. People know when they're slightly breaking the rules. You may recall that, of course, we could go shopping. And there were a couple of times, and one in case, where I stopped a member of the public, and the first thing they did was pull out a shopping bag, as if it was, if you like, a passport to travel. And we sort of smiled at each other, and then I said, well, if we're going shopping, then that's one thing. So it isn't scripted, but we look to explain and engage, and largely speaking, the vast majority have listened to it.
Yes, I know. We seem to have lost Deputy Hewlin, so that means for the moment we are not.
That's Deputy
Poynton, sorry. Andy, I think we will need to pause.
Okay. I can't pause the thing. I might have to just check one thing. 1 second.
Okay, so we'll just see whether we can get Deputy Poynton back. A bit of a technical issue here.
Unfortunately, I can't end the pause. There's no pause button. If I press end, that's it. It's ended. Give me 2 seconds.
Just wonder whether you can contact Deputy Poynton and see whether.
See if I can invite him.
What ramifications of continuing?
Well, we need to be caught for the public record.
Okay.
And we've got quite a few questions to go, so it's a.
Well, we've been.
Well, I think the fact that we've got
important to the island, so that's why we've been spending a lot of time on it.
Yeah, I think the issue is going to be technical at some times. We've been relatively successful so far in getting everybody connected in. It just so happens that this time we've got a bit of a technical issues elsewhere. Can I ask you to bear with it for one moment?
I'm just trying to invite Deputy Poynton back in, just so you're aware.
Okay.
It's coming up to say no response from Deputy Poynton, so I assume he's having some form of technical difficulty. Generally speaking, the procedural advice that I would be giving at this point, if this was a physical public hearing in the Caplan or Blanc would be that the panel could not continue because it is incorrect. I think given the circumstances and the fact that it is obviously a technical issue here, and it's maybe possible to get the 50 points back in the not too distant future, I'll continue trying to contact him. I think ultimately it is a decision for the panel and the minister to come to as to whether or not the minister is comfortable to continue the hearing given the circumstances.
I think that's the situation we had before when somebody wasn't very well. So can I ask the minister, are you happy to continue just with the two of us?
Very happy, Chairman.
Then in that case, I think we'd be happy to continue as well, because this is on the public record and we have shared questions and so on, so we can cover other people's questions. Okay, Deputy Hewing, do you want to continue quickly?
Can't remember where I was.
No, that's why I was hoping you continue.
I was.
I think you were talking about. I think the next bit.
Consistency of advice, and one thing I'd like to go forward is the draft regulations to be debated tomorrow. How are you going to ensure that, I think it's up to level 1 fines, are going to be again consistently administered? And what advice would be given to the centeniers and the honorary police?
It's not a matter for the police to give fines. The only people who can give a fine is the court or the centenier at a parish hall inquiry with the agreement of the alleged offender. The police do not issue fines.
No, sorry, I didn't say that very well. I remember my days as an honorary, but you could have there's a guide of, say, speeding offence. There's a guide, a chart that is clearly laid out that you charge a fine at an amount over and above the speeding offence, and the centeniers knew those guidelines. So the question is, what guidelines will be given to the centeniers to ensure there's consistency of fines for any of these breaches of regulation?
Yeah, normally in these situations, the Attorney General gives a general guidance to the centeniers, so there is consistency throughout the parishes, and indeed the centeniers within the parishes. But nevertheless, the centeniers do have the discretion to amend those recommendations depending on the type of offence, the severity of the offence that there might be before the centenier, and the centenier could actually refuse to take jurisdiction and refer it to the magistrate's court in any event. So there would be, yes, there would be guidance, as there is with other offences, but the centenier retains discretion. And as you know, at a parish hall inquiry, if the alleged offender does not accept the decision of the centenier, they can have it arbitrated by the magistrate's court anyway.
Okay. Are you happy with the tone of the? Sorry, is that Trevor back again?
Yeah, but I'm not happy. It's not charging.
Well, while you're back, should we go forward to your next section? Sorry, Chair, to make that suggestion.
I'm not able to do that because I'm having to keep my finger on the.
Okay, I'll tell you what, we'll carry on the two of us, Trevor. If you're here or not, we've agreed with the Minister that we can continue with just the two of us. So we'll crack on with the questions. If you carry on.
And if I resolve this problem, I'll let you know and I'll come back in.
That's brilliant. It was about the Minister's assessment of how the lockdown is being observed, I believe.
Yeah.
That you're talking about. How would you assess that, Minister, about how your assessment effectively of how the lockdown has been observed in general?
I think in general, and I think my view is backed up by the police, and certainly by the honorary police, the vast majority of people have responded extremely well and positively to the stay-at-home rules and regulation. I don't think there's any question about that. There have been some obvious examples of people who have not, some quite high-profile ones, and those have been dealt with as best as possible by the state police and the honorary police. But in the main, the vast majority of people have responded extremely well, and I think that's proven by the what has happened with the number of cases. I mean, if you go back to the end of March, we if we hadn't done the things we've done, and we were predicting a quite significant number of people with the virus, a huge number of people off work, and I think the policy of the government and the reaction of the population has put us in a very, very good place now.
Do you think there could be any improvements to the tone and frequency of these communications as we learn, as we're going along in these extraordinary circumstances?
Well, I'm not quite sure what you mean about that, but certainly the information put out there on social media, the traditional media, by the press conferences of the Chief Minister and his colleagues have put a tremendous amount of information out there, and the population have reacted very positively to it.
I think the vast majority have. I think that's a given.
Yeah.
Absolutely. What's your advice to members of the public when they observe breaches in light of these ever-changing advice?
Well, I think it's the same advice as we gave at the very beginning. If you're noticing certain situations, not observing physical distancing and so on, do send a message to the notisolating.gov.je email page, and that will give email address, and that will give information. If it's an emergency situation, ring 999, or if it's between the two, ring the police on 612. But don't use the emergency line of 999 and block that up for anything which is not an emergency, because that can cause problems not just to the police, but of course to fire and ambulance services as well. That is very, very important.
I think moving on to the next one, I think on public record, the island has behaved absolutely fantastically during this, and we're dealing very, very much with a very, very small minority that we need to reach out and ensure that they play their part in getting over this pandemic in crisis. Thank you. Over to you, Rob.
Okay, yeah, I'll try to ask some questions that Deputy Poynton was going to ask about drugs and alcohol policy and situations. Have the police seen an increase in drug and alcohol related offences in the home as a result of lockdown? There have been some interesting reports from the UK, for example. Is that reflected in Jersey?
The answer to that is no. And getting a sense of some of the likely issues and concerns that the panel would want to ask. We've seen no notable increase in the number of drug and alcohol related offences during lockdown. I guess I think I would have probably expected to see a greater increase from an alcohol point of view, and maybe less from a drugs point of view, because of course I'm willing to put my sort of neck on the line here and say drug importation may have dropped quite significantly since the lockdown period. No startling information there for any of our journalists listening, I guess, but we have done a number of drugs warrants in the last week or two to use some of the intelligence that we've had before. But no, the answer to that question is we've not seen a significant increase.
And in terms of those who are addicts who may have continued to find themselves in breach of lockdown requirements, have you had conversations with public health regards that? And what sort of support is being offered to those people so that they can stay safe?
Certainly during the lockdown period, our drug and alcohol referrals, we continue to do that either through our custody centre or via our engagement officers to advise those agencies that can provide support and assistance to our drug addicts. But there is no sort of notable, I can't say that we've seen a notable increase in that either.
Yeah. And is there an increased sensitivity perhaps when dealing with those who are known addicts on the island in the current circumstance? Is this good? I don't know whether it's the right wording. Is this an opportunity to perhaps engage more, given perhaps the difficulty in obtaining, if there's less drugs imported, it might be an opportunity to break a cycle every so often. Can you see that happening?
Absolutely, I can, and I think it is. You know, having been in the police service 30 years, whilst drug enforcement absolutely is vital, is an important tactic, the long-term health issues are the ones where you can make the real significant differences. This is an addiction and an illness, which, as a result, as members will know, leads to crime, and that's where I sort of get involved. So yes, I do think there is an opportunity to break the cycle, probably maybe, hopefully, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to break a cycle, because it would have disrupted routine behaviour, whether you're a drug addict or otherwise.
I think it might be worth mentioning, I mean, obviously, as Robin intimated there, that the traditional routes of importing drugs by air or by sea have virtually disappeared. So our colleagues at Customs and Immigration have found an increase through the post. Through the Jersey Post, so that they have intercepted a lot more than they would normally do in that area. But I'm not sure if Julian wanted to say something on this. Did I misunderstand?
No, thank you, Minister. Yeah, just in relation to the question from a public harm point of view, I'm not going to comment on the enforcement element. That's Robin's job. But from a public harm point of view, I think I've mentioned previously, Chair, that I've been chairing a meeting with mental health colleagues and other agencies, drug and alcohol as well, to understand and share information as to how those agencies are adapting and working in this current environment due to COVID. Certainly the drug and alcohol services are suggesting that they're seeing an increase of about 20% in terms of consumption, particularly from an alcohol point of view. Now, obviously, a lot of their services now are online, as indeed so is mental health. So they're ringing people and having online conversations using this sort of technology as opposed to face-to-face meetings. So they are adapting in the current environment. But I think we'd all understand is they are seeing much more drinking within the home, because obviously the opportunity outside has been much restricted. So that is quite challenging, and obviously they are people who are known to the services or are new to services, hence the identified increase.
And there would need to be that's the sensitivity I was talking about in dealing with people and their backgrounds, for example. And I think it's one of the concerns behind the social distancing regulations. I'm conscious of time and getting onto some very important topics as well, not the ones being covered on. But in terms of move on to PPE and testing, which I think is hugely important to a lot of people on the island. What PPE is being provided to police and other enforcement services, and I'll come on to ask about ambulance service as well, when undertaking their roles?
Well, this is something obviously I've been very interested in from day one, and I've kept a regular check with the heads of service, police, customs, prison, ambulance, fire, and all of the heads of service report to me that the level of personal protection equipment that they have is adequate for their requirements. None of them, Peter and Robin are here to speak for themselves, but my understanding is that they have no complaints about the level of equipment they have been provided with. But Peter and Robin can speak for themselves on that.
Okay, if you want to add anything to that?
Peter, do you want to talk about PPE?
Certainly, Minister. Well, I can say that we've had the same levels of PPE as issued to all colleagues in health. Level 2 PPE, which is a slightly lower level that's used for the majority of jobs, and a level 3 PPE, which is a higher level of mask, and we let the staff carry out a dynamic risk assessment that allows them to decide if the higher level of PPE is required for any of the particular jobs they're doing. But particular jobs that have close work with respiratory efforts such as resuscitation would require level 3 PPE, and we've got sufficient stocks of all of that.
And is there a suitable mechanism if you have any concerns that you can raise rapidly? Because obviously situations, I'd imagine, could change rapidly as well, particularly within the ambulance service, well, within the police service as well, obviously. But, yeah.
Yeah, so we've regularly updated the advice and guidance as it's been updated to us. We have a PPE cell that is working within Health and Community Services that we're in regular contact with, that reviews national guidance, local guidance, and therefore we can report any concerns through there. There is an emergency stock also that we can access if required, and there is a central organisation in government now for supplying the PPE to us regularly as we require it.
Okay, before I go on to Ronan, can I just get in there about who controls that strategy then? The overall strategy of PPE within the police ambulance now, is that a clear line of sight as to the person making that overall decision?
Can I, Minister, could I?
Yes, please, Julian.
So the current demand profiling and distribution purchasing of PPE is as Pete Gabby mentioned, is coordinated centrally through the PPE cell. I have oversight of that on behalf of government. We have very good stocks of PPE across the board currently. Those stock levels and the demand levels are published to ministers twice weekly at the moment, either at a competent authorities meeting or at the Emergencies Council, so ministers have...
Sorry, can I just interrupt? When you say oversight, when you have oversight, is that is oversight mean responsibility, i.e. the final word, or is oversight a collective amongst the council or that group, that cell as you've called it, which would then have a collective discussed response to the need? Just to be clear.
Yeah, I am responsible for the coordination of PPE across government.
Okay.
I've been asked to do that, and then there's a cell that is set up which has got a number of different people in that, from a procurement point of view, from a clinical point of view, from a logistical and distribution point of view, and everybody accesses that cell and their requests are put in and stocks are delivered appropriately. Okay,
so that cell would advise and you'd make the final decision overall?
Yeah.
Okay. Roland, did you have a question?
It's a bit tactical, really. Should the ambulance teams be wearing PPE equipment at all times? And what is their guidelines as to when they do and they may not have to wear it?
So the guidance comes out centrally, as we've just mentioned. It comes from the PPE coordination group, and the PPE that they're wearing is required when they actually tend a job with a patient. All other times, social distancing is important, and therefore as important to our crews to keep apart. Where they are in contact in the front of vehicles for any time, then they have surgical masks to wear. So they are provided with all the equipment they need when they need it.
So they're wearing at all times when they're in front or with potential patients? When
they're in contact with patients, yes.
Okay, and the priority in terms of as to who given to emergency workers, that's clear and that's working well? Or,
sorry, John, I didn't quite catch that.
The priority for emergency workers is decided upon. So it's clear that ambulance staff have PPE of either level 2 or level 3, which they can access quite successfully. I hope it was what you were saying. And that's the same for other police. So if they're attending an arrest, they would have the appropriate PPE that they need. And I recognise that would be a very difficult situation.
I think to add to that, it's worthwhile just remembering where we came from and where we've got to. You can imagine, certainly in the UK, PPE became a highly political issue and a big concern. We have, to share both Julian and Pete's view, we have access to all the PPE that we need. Yes, it was difficult in the first few weeks because there was concerns, but then large orders arrived. And of course, the difference with policing, as may occasionally be different with the ambulance services, is sometimes we are going through a door where the public don't want us, and they don't want us to be there. And that exposes officers to greater risk for reasons you'll understand. So we have adopted the guidance from the National Police Chiefs Council, which is underpinned by Public Health England, where it actually provides very useful guidance around different scenarios, whether we will use particular equipment. But there is the obvious example, of course, is that, you know, sometimes we have to lay hands on to people who don't want us to put their hands on them. And that provides greater risk for our officers. And I don't think, short of a full suit, there's ever going to be anything that I can do to absolutely completely protect them, which is the reason why we want to avoid those arrests unless we absolutely have to.
And that leads us on to testing of employees.
Chair.
Yes, go on, Charlie. You're back.
My battery indicator tells me there is some charge in the battery now. Could I go back to Peter? And hello, Peter. We haven't said hello for a long time. Would you be able to explain to the public what the various levels of PPE are?
Certainly. So level 2 PPE is a plastic apron, surgical mask, gloves, and examination gloves that they would wear routinely, and then the availability of a visor based on a risk assessment by the crews. When we say level 3 PPE, we're talking about for anything, any procedures that produce aerosols. And for those sort of procedures, level 3 is then moved up to a surgical gown or a what we can call a Tyvek suit, and a FFP3 mask, which is a high level mask to prevent those aerosols being breathed in.
So that's the extent of your protection. And of course, protection to the client, to the patient as well. How does that translate into the police force? Because we're talking about surgical gowns and so on and so forth. If you're involved in an incident on the street, you're called to an incident on the street, how do you then gear up to the potential for a highly aerosol contact with general public?
Will I answer that?
Yeah.
It is one of the those areas that has caused a good deal of discussion over the last few months, for the reasons that I just described. That often when the police service turn up and the ambulance service turn up, they're welcomed with open arms. And of course, the example, which is a really good one and a very practical one, is not always the case. All of our officers have access to the disposable gloves, disposable aprons, goggles, the various solutions that can be used to disinfect hands, etc. But there is a simple practicality to some of this, that even if one of Pete's staff ended up, which would not necessarily be unusual with dealing with, you know, a patient in crisis, there is the inevitability that people could get exposed because of you know, a confrontational situation. So we understand that, we accept that, but we provide as much of the protective equipment as we possibly can, has been described by Peter.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chair. There was just a couple more things. These are your questions, Deputy Poynton, but
apologise.
That's okay. Actually, no, they're not. They're my ones. How many staff across the emergency services have been signed off due to COVID-19 matters, illness or caring for loved ones, etc.?
It's been relatively small. I think there have been 2 or 3 at the ambulance station. I think 1 at fire. I think 2 at police, and I don't think any at prison or or fire. No, not fire. Customs and immigration. And to the best of my knowledge, and Peter and Ron will talk about their own staff, all have now recovered, and there might be one or two still self-isolating, but there were 3 or 4 officers in ambulance and in police who actually were tested positive, self-isolated and recovered, and are now back at work.
And in terms of, just to talk about testing on from that, are you, there is a testing regime for essential workers. Are you gaining access to that? Are you finding that useful? And what is your time scale for testing your staff? Effectively, how will you be using that?
Yeah, it's something I've pushed very, very hard for, and now the testing, I believe the PCR testing has just started for the frontline staff, which includes ambulance, police, but also fire, customs and immigration, and prison. I believe that has just started, and we are, I'm sure Peter and Robin will confirm, encouraging our staff. It's a voluntary thing, obviously, encouraging our staff to take advantage of this facility.
That's PCR testing, is it? Not the
PCR testing for the emergency frontline services.
Okay. Yeah, I've been interested to hear from Peter or whether that's working for you.
Yes, so as the Minister mentioned, it's fairly new, just started. The PCR testing has been offered out on a voluntary basis to all staff. If they obviously test positive to that, then they'd be immediately into isolation. There's also serology testing, which is the antibody testing that is also being rolled out to various areas and available to staff as well at the same time. And
from a policing point of view, you may wish to invite Julian in, because it's been his team that have done a lot of this organising. Exactly the same as Peter. We've also been very keen to get testing done for our officers who we think have been exposed. So, for example, I was briefing the Minister earlier on an incident that happened over the weekend, for which we would seek to get an officer tested very, very quickly. But exactly that's my experience. Indeed, I went to get a PCR test on Sunday morning, and it was very effective, very efficient. They knew I was coming. I was there probably less than 3 or 4 minutes. Had the test done and left. So it was, that was the one up at the airport. But Chair Julian may wish to have a view or share a view about some of the organising he's done.
Can I ask? I'm conscious of time, and we've got some other questions. Can I just ask a key question of what's the turnaround time for those PCR tests? Is it 24 hours? Are they the 24-hour tests?
I think it's 48 hours.
48 hours. Okay.
Any are coming back though fairly quickly. I had one myself some time ago, and they were turned around within about 6 to 8 hours. And
they've been done on island, are they?
There's a mixture. There's some have been done online, some have been sent away just because of numbers.
So there's the testing that's been, sorry Rob, there's the testing that's taken place for all basically government employees who have interaction with the public, and that's taking place at Kennedy Sports Centre and Springfield, for sake of argument. Which testing are we talking about for your frontline officers? Is it that test, or is it the other PCR test, which is laboratory based?
So if I could help, maybe the priority that was pushed very strongly by the Minister was to get all the frontline services, particularly emergency services, tested for PCR, the swab test that the Chief of Police just referred to and the Chief Ambulance Officer referred to. So that is now available for all those staff. But the same, very similar to that, last week we announced the antibody test, the serology test as well, to those people who qualify, which is anybody who's worked away from the home for 5 days since the stay-at-home order. So actually that also includes emergency services as well. Priority was to get the PCR test done, as you know, Deputy, that indicates whether somebody's got COVID-19 now. But actually I think what we'll find is both those tests are being utilised by the emergency services.
Because the PCR test, the swab test, which I'm familiar with, which is laboratory based, if you take the pinprick test that's taking place at Kennedy and Springfield, that also initially has a test to whether you have COVID or not at that time. It then goes on to look at whether you have any antibodies to it. So
it gives you two results, doesn't it? IgG and IgM. So if you're the latter one, it doesn't give you 100%. It says you may have COVID. You then have to have a PCR test and self-isolate.
That's what I'm coming to, is to make sure that's the swab test that the frontline officers are having, not the three-letter acronym that you have at Springfield and Kennervay that public servants are being invited to have. Okay, I think it is clear to me, but I'm just not sure it's clear to the outside world. Okay.
We'll move forward. We've got some questions on the target operating model, but we'll put those in writing as we will focus on these questions around COVID. So in general, one of the questions I wanted to ask was how many prisoners have been released on licence during this outbreak to create capacity and social distancing to be allowed in prisons? Do you have a number for that?
Yes, none. The change in the prison rules was to enable release on licence if it became necessary, and so far the prison is COVID-free, and therefore there's no need to introduce that or to use that provision. And I've got to say that I think we're grateful to the prison management and staff for keeping it that way and reacting very quickly when COVID arrived by stopping visitors, introducing video links for the courts and indeed to replace visitors. So at this moment in time, the answer is none, but the facility is there should the worst happen.
Okay, well, that's reassuring. There were questions. Are you due to bring any additional emergency legislation for the COVID-19 crisis, given that we seem to be moving away from lockdown a little, and with any luck, touch wood, we won't see a second wave, which I'm sure we all hope for, that we don't have to go through that. Any other emergency legislation that we might need to know about that's in the pipeline?
Yeah, I mean, there's two things. One, I think it's difficult to call it emergency, but it does need to be done, is the phase 2 of the marriage law and civil partnership law to change the rules about how these marriages can take place from July the 1st to incorporate physical distancing and so on. So we're bringing forward something on that fairly shortly. And the other thing, we are still in discussions with the police, council of ministers and appropriate officers about fixed penalty notices, because as I've mentioned here before, the only sanction that we have, if there is a break, if there is a suggestion of a break in social distancing or the other rules, the only sanction we have is to arrest, put in the police cell, bring in a centennial to charge, and then go to court or parish hall inquiry when they eventually come about. Now, I still believe that a sanction of a fixed penalty notice would give the opportunity of a perpetrator to discharge their liability for an offence without having to go to court or parish hall inquiry. But that is something which is still under discussion. And indeed, I think we provided you with we did provide you with a draft of the law, but we still need to move that on.
I think there will be further discussion on that. I'm conscious we're really coming to the end of time. Roland, do you want to ask a quick question, and then Trevor has one? Go on.
We adopted the unlawful public entertainment legislation in March, and we made a recommendation that should be time limited, like most other regulations, to terminate on the 30th of September. Minister, you were going to bring an amendment to that effect. Where are you with?
Sorry, I missed the beginning of that one, Deputy. What?
Yeah, we passed
public entertainment law.
The unlawful public entertainment legislation in March we adopted, and the recommendation from our panel was that would be time-stamped, i.e. terminate on the 30th of September, which is in line with virtually every other emergency legislation that we have passed through the Assembly. Our recommendation is you bring an amendment to that effect, and we're wondering where that is, where you are with that process.
Thank you for reminding me about that one, Deputy. I shall have to check that one out.
Well, thank you for that commitment.
That was why we wanted to get that question in. Thank you very much. Trevor, do you want to ask a quick question? We may go a little bit over
it's very
time,
quick. It's just that, and we're going back to this business of the debate we're going to have tomorrow about the health, a proposition to introduce a Centennial-led prosecution in that law. Does that law, or would, if it were adopted, would that law actually negate the need for a fixed penalty?
No, not in my view, Deputy, because the same process would need to be followed whether the parish hall inquiry facility is there or not. That the police would still have to arrest, the police would still have to keep in the police cells. The Centennial would still have to go to the police station to make the charge. The Centennial would then need to make a decision, as I mentioned before, whether to refer to a parish hall inquiry, which would mean waiting till September at the current time, or to go to court.
Can I introduce the idea that police should have the facility of issuing a notice to an individual to attend a parish hall inquiry, which they should be able to do given the relaxation of the current association laws. The association advice says that people up to 5 people currently are able to get together. Why would that not apply in a parish hall?
Well, because you've still got to keep 1 metre apart from anybody else.
2 meters.
Sorry, big pardon. 2.
Yeah. And surely most of the parish halls have a very large auditorium in which they'd be able to achieve those distances.
Yeah, indeed. I mean that might be physically practical in some areas. At the present time, the advice from the Attorney General was there'd be no parish hall inquiries until September. That may well change, but I welcome the Minister of Health for actually bringing this in. But of course, you've still got the other laws as well, the workplace law and the construction law, which doesn't have that facility.
I have to say, and without discussing this in detail, and we're short of time, that some of the proposals coming forward seem to be entirely contradictory. And I won't go into that at present, but they do seem to be. And we've had long discussions today about those contradictions.
So you talk about the law being proposed tomorrow?
That and others coming forward perhaps on the 2nd of June.
Mm.
Civil marriage and the limitations on gatherings and so on and so forth. There are a lot of contradictions in this new legislation coming forward.
I think
I don't want to pursue that.
I'm sure you'll bring that to our attention, and
I'm sure.
I think I'd finish off by saying that there certainly needs to be an awareness of different ministers having pieces of legislation that overlap, and that's certainly an issue that we've faced in scrutiny, and sometimes it's been difficult because they do overlap, and we need to be aware of that. Can I finish with one question, because I know we're out of time, for the Minister. Given the outstanding work that's been done by our services of police, ambulance, fire, all of those public services, I take it that the Minister will be encouraging a decent pay rise this year. Will you be pushing for that?
Well, do you know, Deputy, that really is a matter for the representatives of the services and the state's employment boards, and you do not expect me to possibly comment on such a suggestion.
Minister, we are in unusual times. We should be taking unusual steps.
But can I say to you, Chairman, and your colleagues, that I've nothing but the highest respect and highest regard for all of our frontline services. They've done a terrific job, and particularly 2 guys are with us today in leading their services in very, very difficult circumstances, and they've come up trumps, and I've got the highest regard and respect for them and their staff.
Oh, they absolutely share that regard.
I'm sure you do.
We do, absolutely.
Absolutely. Unless there's anything else that anyone wants to ask, or you've got any questions for the panel, then we've run over a little, but we had a few technical gremlins which we solved, I think, quite calmly. We kept calm and we carried on, and we'll call a hearing unless there's anything from anybody. I'll call the hearing to an end and say thank you very much for your time, and again thank you to all those services that are keeping us safe.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Thank you.